My name is Dom Anders. This winter, I called my estranged brother for the first time in a year to tell him our Aunt Nell had died. I really just had one question for him, which was, what do you want to do with her house? Neither one of us had seen Aunt Nell for 35 years. We spent a combined total of 5 weeks there over 2 summers back when we were 10. She was our last surviving relative, and when she died, we inherited her place in Bremerton, Pennsylvania. According to a neighbor who called me, when she died, it was pretty much a disaster, had been for years. So neither one of us really wanted to deal with cleaning it out, making repairs, listing it. At one point during the conversation with my brother, I said, Gary, can you imagine the mess, that nasty old basement and the attic? And Gary said, well, there was no attic, but I guess the basement would be horrible. I corrected him on this. I said, you don't remember the attic? It was one of those where the door is built into the ceiling and there was a long stick with a hook you had to catch the latch with. And he said testily, you're completely wrong. You're thinking of some other house. Your memory's bad. And he and I actually got into an argument about it. We always fought anyway. But neither one of us would admit the other was right, and he wound up hanging up on me, like he sometimes did. The attic thing gnawed at me. I called him a week later and I brought it up again, trying to be funny about it, but he reacted badly. He said, look, I don't know what your game is in trying to convince me of something that wasn't there. But if you bring this up again, you'll be dealing with that sewer of a house on your own. You have to understand, my brother's had it very bad all his life. I told him I was worried that he was blocking it out for some reason, that maybe he should ask his therapist about it if he was still going. We had never gone up into the attic, but if he was actively denying the memory entirely, maybe something had happened up there that I didn't know about. Gary countered with, no, don't be trying to solve me with some phantom abuse crap. You're using a false memory to let you play God with your poor screwed-up brother. Oh, if only he remembered what happened in the attic at Weird Aunt Nell's. He could magically straighten out, and Big Brother wouldn't feel so guilty. And before you start poking around in my brain, he said, did you ever figure out why you get physically sick at the sight of cotton candy? I didn't get a whole lot of sleep that night. I thought this was something that needed to be resolved. And worse, Gary had me doubting my own memory. The image of an attic door in the ceiling was so vivid. The thing was, I just couldn't recall Aunt Nell ever mentioning it or warning us away from it. Nell. My mother had never talked about her much. Nell had been kind of a spinster. She was on disability or something. Or there was some small inheritance, I forget which. She was skinny as a rail, didn't have any friends that I recall. She wasn't much of a guardian. She'd let us roam until after dark, and of course Gary, the bad seed, sometimes came in even later, making up some lie about visiting the neighbor across the street. Nell would do things like ask us what her favorite food was, but then she would make it every night during our whole stay, spaghetti, every night. She would make collages with us, no end of them. The three of us cutting pictures from old magazines from the turn of the century. Not fun ones kids might like. And when I showed one of the collages to my mother in the fall, she lost it because Nell had us cut up some really valuable magazines she was supposed to be selling off to support herself. Or there was this old chair in her living room that spun around. My brother and I were always spinning in it. And one time I woke up in the middle of the night and I walked down the hall to the bathroom and I saw Aunt Nell spinning the chair around with her hand, faster and faster, just like me and Gary did. But she wasn't sitting in it, she just spun it around. In the end, Gary wouldn't meet me at the house. We both lived about 2 hours away, but I was east and he was west. I doubted he even had a car at that point in his life. He'd run away when he was 16, and he never came back. He worked at dead-end jobs all over, landing in jail twice. He needed to help me out with the house if we were going to sell it. I made that clear, but he refused to even let me pick him up. And that just made me more convinced that something was up. Something deeper than he knew with his conscious mind. So, this very morning, 11 hours ago now, I drove out to the rural outskirts of Premonton by myself. I parked the car in the dirt driveway that I used to pretend was the end zone of an imaginary football field, and looked at the house from the outside for a while. Dumpy little thing, sadder than I even remembered. The neighbors down the road had mowed the lawn for Nell as she got older, but someone had neglected to do it recently. I took the key I'd been sent out of my pocket, and I went in. The place smelled like cats. There were no real personal knickknacks around, which I thought was kind of strange. And then I remembered the place had always been like that. But there were books everywhere, in stacks and crammed into shelves awkwardly. Newspapers, jigsaw puzzles, maps, and very strange instruction manuals for all kinds of things. Everything from vacuum cleaners to VCRs to tractors. The other things Nell had hoarded were scarves and gloves and mittens. Winter things. How much all of this was Aunt Nell being her odd self and how much was the onset of dementia, I don't know. The dust and cobwebs were pretty extreme. There were huge water stains on the ceiling, the floor. The spinning chair was still there, in the exact same place. I went toward Aunt Nell's bedroom because I thought I heard something in there. Voices. It was only her little clock radio. For God knows how long it had been very softly playing the local AM talk station. Disconnected tiny voices speaking into dead Aunt Nell's bedroom, with a bad painting of a cornfield on the wall and bags of clothes all around. I shut the thing off and then stepped out into the hallway again, remembering the real reason I had wanted to come there that day. Looking up at the ceiling in the hallway, I saw nothing there but yellowing paint and cobwebs. It was here I was sure that the attic had been. Its clear borders etched above us as we reluctantly played in this house as children. Confused, I walked around, trying to find the attic somewhere else. There was nowhere else it could be. And so, my brother had been right. I was walking through the kitchen toward the cellar when I heard the front door open again. Incredibly, it was Gary. He'd taken the bus all the way to Premonton, and then walked 3 miles from the station, an act of self-sufficiency that would usually have been far beyond his limited ambition. I was speechless. We didn't have any words of greeting for each other, distant as always. We seemed to both know what the other was thinking, and so the first thing he said to me was, "It's not here, is it?" He looked terrible. He'd put on more weight over what used to be solid, scary muscle. And he'd gotten another pointless skull tattoo to go with the one he'd gotten during his 6-month sentence for assault in Ohio. This one was on his neck. "No," I said. "It's not here." I opened the cellar door, flicked the light switch, and started down. Gary didn't follow me. At first I was grateful that there was really nothing in the basement at all. Nell must have stopped going down there long ago, too dangerous for her to navigate the steps. But what remained on the cement floor was so strange that I would have rather had the clutter. There were 7 discolored men's suits lying stretched out on the floor, jackets and pants, arranged just so with accompanying gloves and shoes to create the effect of 7 non-existent men lying near each other, facing the ceiling. And where each head would be, there was a magazine cutout of one, Random men's faces cut from whatever magazine Nell probably had lying around. Frozen smiles from men in ads. These had been crudely fused to the cement floor with some kind of adhesive. A gallery of men who didn't exist, whose mismatched and moth-eaten clothes had been gotten from thrift stores, probably. I looked above me. No attic. I went back up the stairs, wishing I had never come here, never known the extent of poor Aunt Nell's dementia. I felt terrible for thinking about her so poorly. She'd asked my mother if she could take care of us long ago, just for a couple of weeks during 2 summers, and my mother had relented. Nell had been strange, but there was no call for me to be suspicious of her. I'd just gotten the attic thing completely wrong. I looked up from the bottom of the staircase, and Gary was just standing there, watching me, looking huge and intimidating. He had made a point not to come down. There was something he was afraid of. I knew it. We poked around the house silently for a little while, thinking our own thoughts. We had a subdued discussion over the details of finding an agent to list the place and someone to make repairs. While I took a longer look at things, he went off into the spare bedroom, where we had slept as children, to lie down for a while. I was pretty sure he was drunk. Standing at the kitchen sink, washing my hands after running it over all those dusty surfaces, I looked through the window at the storm clouds rolling in, and I had a view of the little old house across the road, sitting alone on 2 acres. The sight of it brought something back in a flood, all at once. Without saying anything to my brother, I left the house, closing the door behind me very softly and leaving it open just a crack. And I crossed Aunt Nell's lawn. I checked for cars coming down Route 30. There were none, as usual. And I walked across the neighbor's lawn up to the front door. Every step I took, I felt more and more like a trespasser. I looked back over my shoulder to see if maybe Gary was watching me through a window. But no. There were no cars in the driveway. I remembered that Mr. Zillett, who had lived here, seemed very old to me even back then, and hadn't had one. I knocked on the door. There was no response to either my first or second efforts. I walked around the back of the house. The property showed signs of having slowly become just as decrepit as Aunt Nell's. I knocked on the back door once to no avail. And maybe I would have turned and gone back across the road if it hadn't started to rain just then. I turned the knob and the door opened freely. A lot of people out here never lock their doors. I went into the house for just the second time in my life, calling out to whoever might be inside. Mr. Zillett had wanted us to come over whenever Aunt Nell drove the 9 miles into town for groceries. But after one single time, I hadn't wanted to visit again that second summer. I had a trace memory of being left alone there just for a little while. Gary and Mr. Zillett had walked down to the pond, but I hadn't gone with them because I was afraid of the bees down there. And for some reason, I had never crossed the road to the house again. In the living room, old framed photos told me right away that this was still, in fact, Mr. Zillett's place, though he was nowhere to be seen. It had been kept very neatly inside, at least. His relatives must have been paying a service. I went right into the hallway leading to the bedroom. I poked my head in there. There was nobody inside it, just a small, unmade bed, a painting of Christ on the wall. Turning around, I looked up, and there it was, the door in the ceiling, the attic. The long pole that would catch the latch was in the corner of the kitchen beside the refrigerator. I looked out the window across the lawn at my aunt's house. The rain made it tough to see if the front door was still open the tiniest crack. I'd been gone for 15 minutes. I found a small flashlight below the sink and I stuck it in my back pocket. When I stood again, looking up at the attic, I felt suddenly dizzy and black spots danced in front of my eyes. I had to put a hand against the wall to keep from fading. I think my subconscious was trying to keep me from going up there. It was going to be bad. 35 years of buried memories were pressing in on me, strangling me, and my brain was deciding if it was better to try to shut me down than relive something I shouldn't. The pole caught the latch and I pulled down on it. The long plank opened outwards in a billow of dust and unfolded in 2 creaky segments. It wasn't a ladder leading up so much as a crude set of thin planks nailed horizontally onto a thick bed of pink insulation backed by plywood. My brother's words about the cotton candy thing rose in my head. It's true, since I was a kid, I haven't been able to taste the stuff, smell it, even look at it without feeling queasy. I knew immediately this was why. That part of the puzzle fell into place for me in an instant. The insulation on the ladder. I started up, surprised at how difficult it was to keep a hold on the planks. Though as a 10-year-old, it wouldn't have been hard at all. It would have been exciting. The air up there was so thick and dry and heavy, I wondered how long I could even stay in that dark womb. I couldn't quite stand up straight. The flashlight was surprisingly strong. Judging by the film of dust, nothing up here had been touched in many, many years. Sealed and unsealed cardboard boxes, a bag of golf clubs, plastic planters, a sleeping bag, a neatly folded stack of blankets, several pairs of shoes, 2 lamps lying on their sides. The floor beneath me was very thin, creaking loudly. More pink insulation lined the slanting walls of the roof. I decided to just stand there for a time, staring down at a box containing 4 cans of paint, 2 open and dried all the way through, 2 still sealed, and waiting for a feeling to come, trying to remember what I had been doing up here way back then. Simple exploration, I'm sure, thrilling to the sense of danger and the forbidden. And then I had made a point of never returning to the house. 2 feet to my left, I saw something down on the floor that made me feel faint again. It was a dented, faded box that had at some point contained a set of porcelain dishes bought at Sears. The price tag was still partially there. From the 60s, most likely. I recognized the box right away. I had touched it long ago. The top was closed but not sealed. I knelt down beside it, my right knee in the dust, shining the flashlight on the lid. Well behind me, I heard the rain outside the house rise in volume for the briefest of moments. Someone had come in through the back door. There were light footsteps, eventually entering the hallway. I heard the ladder creak as someone applied their weight to the bottom of it and started to come up. A man's head and torso emerged through the attic floor. Just a silhouette 10 feet away, barely any light coming from below. My brother, his hands gripping the ladder and balancing awkwardly, spoke to me. "If you open that box," he said, "I can't swear to you I won't hurt you." He said, "Everyone does things when they're kids to see what they feel like. You have no right to open that." There in the dark, we couldn't see each other's eyes. Without another word, Gary backed down the ladder, moving less carefully, the wood cracking beneath his weight. His footsteps moved back down the hallway. I could identify him by the sound of his walk alone, the way you can when you know someone for years. I shut off the flashlight and waited for a time in the dark, the closed box from Sears beside my ankle. Reaching out to touch the lid, I think I may have stopped breathing altogether. As soon as my fingers brushed the seam, I knew what I was going to see in there. Certainly it hadn't been sitting in there for 35 years. Undisturbed, what were the odds? I opened the lid. I waited almost a full half hour before I descended the ladder again. I carefully pushed it back up into place and latched it shut using the pole. I moved into the kitchen and was just about to return the pole to its place when I saw a gray cat crouching beside the oven. It was peering head low across the kitchen at the door that led down to the cellar, which I had left partly open. And I realized I had never actually heard my brother leave the house. There hadn't been the sound of a door opening and closing again, or had there been? My memory torturing me once again. I watched the cat, which paid me no attention. It was focused on that crack, coiled in a stalking position as if sensing a threat. But then it lost its focus all at once, like they do, and it scurried off down the hallway where I had come from. I backed out of the kitchen, trying not to make a sound, and I crossed the living room quickly toward the front door. I left the house and I crossed the road in the rain. My brother was nowhere in sight. Aunt Nell's house sat on its acre of dying grass, and nothing stirred within. No face behind the kitchen window peering out. I looked to my left and right down the road, which curved out of sight in both directions. No sign of life. I got into my car and I drove away in the opposite direction of where Gary might have walked. I didn't stop until 2 hours later when I had reached my home, my wife, normality. It's late, it's dark, and it's still raining. And I am in my little home office off the living room where I spend most of my time. The object is on the armrest of the easy chair I'm sitting in. I think Gary had simply hoped no one would ever find it. And then slowly circumstances had kept him away from the house for years. We'd never come back to Aunt Nell's after that last summer. And then there were the arrests and poverty. The decades slipped by, and at some point maybe he'd stopped thinking about it. Until my phone call. The thing beside me is not an old stash of drugs, or even the collar of some pet that had the misfortune of encountering a disturbed 10-year-old boy after dark and was never seen again. It's something so bad I had smothered it entirely as soon as I left that attic back in 1982. It's something so bad that I may live the rest of my life sleeping lightly, frightened of a knock at the door in the middle of the night. It's only partially my brother I'm afraid of. Come to make sure I won't go to the police, no matter what it takes. I know it seems crazy, but I'm really afraid that on my doorstep will be the now elderly parents of a teenaged boy from Bremerton, who we barely knew that summer. Give us that bag, they might say. This withered paper bag beside me that probably once held a peanut butter and jelly sandwich made for Gary by my Aunt Nell. Show us what's inside, so we can finally know what happened to our son. And I just hope the field I'll bury it in tonight, after my wife is asleep, is so vast and overgrown that my mind will hide its location even deeper Then it hid the truth of what my brother truly is.